Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I trust you all have a summary of what I'm going to say. First of all, a few words by way of introduction. For most of South Australia's history, roughly 20 to 25% of the people at census time returned themselves as Methodists. In the 1891 Religions of the People census, for example, there were 76,000 people who said they were Methodists out of a population of 320,000. And this high percentage was peculiar to South Australia. Why? I hope to show later. The Methodist movement, as probably all of you know, had its origins in the work of John Wesley in 18th century Britain. It was a religious revival and part of a wider revival than Methodism. John Wesley himself, of course, was an Anglican priest, as was his brother Charles, and his initial aim was to bring into being a network of societies under the umbrella of the Anglican Church. But the growth of these societies was so considerable that by the time of Wesley's death in 1791, they had developed their own identity. And within 5 or 6 years of Wesley's death, Methodism had become a separate denomination. By the time South Australia was founded in 1836, this Methodism was a divided movement. The divisions were not primarily due to differences in doctrine. To some extent, they were due to conflict of personalities. One of the major issues after Wesley's death was the authority of the ministers, and there did develop considerable opposition to the almost dictatorial authority that ministers wielded in the various Methodist churches. There was also, as the mainstream of Methodism became more and more respectable, considerable opposition to freelance evangelism. As I say, by 1836, when South Australia was founded, there were a number of groups, and 4 came to South Australia. The first was the Wesleyan, which was the main body, the main trunk of the tree which grew out of the work of John Wesley. And the first Wesleyan society was organised in May 1837 in the home of Edward Stevens, the manager of the South Australian Company's Bank. In 1840, a group of people known as Primitive Methodists held a meeting in Light Square, and a few weeks later organised a Primitive Methodist Church. Now, Primitive Methodism originated on the border of Staffordshire and Cheshire around about 1811 and was always strongest among the working class in the new industrial cities thrown up by the Industrial Revolution. Places like Leeds, Bradford, Manchester, and further north in places like Durham and Newcastle on Tyne. Around the same time, another breakaway movement originated in the villages of eastern Cornwall and western Devon. And these people called themselves Bible Christians, and it was a movement which was confined almost entirely to England's southwest. And one of the reasons why there were so many Bible Christians in South Australia, the most famous of whom was Sir Samuel Way, was that the Bible Christian Church was largely a Cornish and to some extent a Devon body. There was a fourth church known as the Methodist New Connection, a very cumbersome title, but the word connection was often used by Methodists to describe their church. What it meant quite simply was that every church was connected with each other and all churches were governed by a conference at the top. Now, the Methodist New Connection was here as early as 1840 in a little building in Hobson's Place off Wright Street, but it virtually died out until the arrival in 1863 of their minister James Morn, who eventually focused his work on Franklin Street, and Morn Church today is the successor to the church which he built in 1865. I want to say something about sources of Methodist history. First of all, you have the minutes of conference. Now, until 1874, there wasn't a South Australian Conference. There was an Australian one from 1855. Prior to that, it was the English Conference. Bible Christians were under the English Conference in 1877. Now, the minutes of conference are a most valuable source in that they give you statistics, they tell you which churches were open and what land was bought, and they give you, of course, the various resolutions. They don't include any debates, and one has to know Methodism, if I can put it that way, to be able to interpret the minutes. For example, in every minute of conference there was a list of the appointments of ministers, and if there was ever a shortage of ministers, then the letters OTBS, or one to be sent, was put along a particular place. Now, an outsider might assume that that meant exactly what it said, that one would be sent. In actual fact, it meant that one wouldn't be sent. It meant that there wasn't enough ministers, and therefore this particular place would be placed under another minister nearby, or it might have meant that a layman, or what Methodists call the home missionary, would be sent. Secondly, church papers. The Wesleyans produced their first paper in 1863, and there was a weekly Methodist paper right through till Methodism merged with Congregationalism and part of Presbyterianism in 1977. At certain times these papers were 12, 16 pages in length. The Bible Christians had their magazine, A Quarterly, from 1867, and the Primitive Methodists had their Record from 1866. The church papers contain accounts of openings, sermons, and correspondence. But one of the most valuable aspects of the church papers is the obituaries which they include. Back in the 19th century, if a leading Methodist died, then he got probably 2-3 pages in the church paper, depending of course on the size of the paper. The obituary described where he was born, when he was converted, what he did for the church, and above all, how he died. And I've discovered an enormous amount of information about sundry people and their families from the various obituaries which appear in church papers. The obituaries plus the sermons are, as I say, a valuable source for, to quote our chairman a few minutes ago, history from below. Now, one weakness of these church papers, of course, is that they always tended to avoid anything that might have brought the good name of the church into disrepute. They always avoided conflicts and anything that might detract from the church's reputation. For example, in 1894, in the Primitive Methodist Record, there was a series of articles dealing with the history of Primitive Methodism in South Australia. And I discovered reading that, what I hadn't known before, that there was for a time a Primitive Methodist church in Mount Gambier. Now, this person writing in 1894 about this church which was established in Mount Gambier in the 1870s summed it up by saying, then through the faithlessness of the minister the cause collapsed. What happened? Did he lose his faith? Well, he might have done. Did he run off with the choir mistress? Well, he might have done. He wouldn't have been the last minister to have done that. The point is that I think it's impossible to know what happened because no other information is given. And then thirdly, you have local church meeting minutes. Now, in Franklin Street, there's a very full record of what are called the quarterly meeting minutes from 1863 right through to 1888 when that church was merged with another. Now, the quarterly meeting was a meeting each quarter of the leading officials of the church. And these quarterly meeting minutes deal with matters such as property, they give membership figures, they deal with general resolutions relating to the life of the church, and a great many of these are available in the archives. Many of the early ones have been lost, And there is certainly a paucity of, for example, marriage registers. Fourthly, you have the daily press, or the weekly press. Now these contain, certainly in the olden days, news of churches, reports of meetings, openings, summaries of addresses, advertisements and so on. Official histories. There hasn't been an official history of Methodism in this state as a whole since 1884, when a man called James Haslam wrote a history of Wesleyan Methodism. He wrote very much from within Methodism, and it is a very hagiographic study. There are two main historical accounts of primitive Methodism in South Australia. The first, which deals with the beginnings of primitive Methodism, in a book by John Petty, published in Britain in 1860, and a fuller summary written by H.B. Kendall, a two-volume history of primitive Methodism as a whole, which contains South Australian material, published around 1902 or 1903. There are copies of Kendall around. I have a copy in one or two other libraries, I think have copies too. As for the Bible Christians, there is a South Australian section in Bourne's book, The Bible Christians, published in 1904 in England. Correspondence from Adelaide to London. Now, the only letters which survive from Methodist leaders here in South Australia to the parent bodies in England are those written by the Wesleyans from 1837 to 1856. And they today are the missionary archives of the School of Oriental and African Studies at London University. And as far as I know, the only copies of those letters which exist in South Australia are in my possession, because I photocopied most of them when I was in England 2 years ago. Now, if I read Pike on early Methodism in South Australia, I'm forced to come to the conclusion that Pike had not read these letters. I think some of his judgments regarding Draper, for example, the leading Methodist superintendent, as well as some of the other Methodist matters dealt with by Pike, reflect his ignorance of those letters. As far as local correspondence is concerned, there's almost none until perhaps 15 or 20 years ago. By local correspondence here, I mean letters sent from the Central Church Office to ministers or to church officials in the suburbs and in country towns. Very little of this survives. I think Ron Gibbs will tell you that there isn't a single letter surviving, for example, from the long period when J.F. Ward was headmaster of Prince Alfred College. Almost no letters written by the president of the conference, a yearly official or head of the church, survive. He would have been the man who dealt with the more interesting and scandalous aspects of church life. And what happened, as in the case of my wife's father, for example, after his death, was that correspondence was consigned to the incinerator. And that correspondence would have been most revealing, but very little survives. There's been something of a development of the conscience with regard to this in the last 15 to 20 years. As for diaries and journals, there are lots of scrapbooks around, consisting mainly of extracts from the church papers dealing with a particular minister and his career, but there are very few diaries or journals. One of the most interesting, and I find one of the most valuable, is in the archives, and consists of a journal. Usually the entries are written up each week, sometimes each month, by a man called John Gibbon Wright, who came out to Borough in 1856 and remained a minister until his death in 1904. And those diary entries relating to Borough in the late 1850s is the only really personal view of Methodism in Borough at the height of its influence in that town that are in existence. Methodism and the voluntary principle. How many of the Methodists who came to South Australia from 1836 onward were attracted by the idea of a colony founded on the voluntary principle? that is to say, a colony in which there would be no state church and in which there would be no state-supported religion. How many of them had contact with George Fife Angus and the South Australian Company? Most of the early Methodists were labourers, but a few others did have links with Angus and were strongly committed to the voluntary principle. Let me name a few of them. There was first of all Samuel Stevens. Samuel Stevens, along with his brothers Edward and John, were sons of a Cornish minister, John Stevens. The Stevens family was a most remarkable family. One brother became the first professor of Scandinavian literature at London University back in the last century. Samuel was Angus's London agent and then the first colonial manager. He arrived in the Duke of York in July 1836 at Kangaroo Island. He was superseded by David McLaren in the following year. He was really no great help to Methodism, not a very good leader of the community on Kangaroo Island, and somewhat irresponsible, which perhaps explains why he killed himself in 1840 accidentally, but nevertheless some would say he was responsible. The second brother, Edward Stevens, was the manager of the company bank. He arrived in January 1837. The first Methodist society was formed in his house. He was a trustee of the first two Methodist churches. He withdrew from the Wesleyan church when the Wesleyans in 1846 decided to accept state aid. And he was active in the body opposed to state aid, the League for the Preservation of Religious Freedom. The third brother was John Stevens. He had been a minister, had been forced to resign in England because of his opposition to the power and authority wielded by Wesleyan ministers. And so he started a newspaper which was strongly critical of Wesleyanism. Then he wrote emigration propaganda for George Fife Angus, including The Land of Promise, which was published in 1839. He arrived in South Australia in 1843. He edited The Observer and The Register, which was strongly critical of state aid, and especially of the Wesleyan policy of adopting it. He died in 1850, not very far from here, at Seacombe, which was the home of his brother Edward. Fourthly, there was a man called Anthony Forster. Now, he had been associated with Angus in Sunday schools in Northumberland. He arrived in 1841 as Angus's agent and was largely responsible for settling the Barossa estate of Angus, helped to lay out the town of Anguston. Later he went into business, made money out of copper at Kapunda, and became editor of the Register. Now, he had been brought up a Wesleyan, but a somewhat rebellious one. And he was one of the chief laymen who helped to run the Methodist New Connection Church in Hobson's Place around about 1840 to about 1844. He was strongly opposed to state aid. And then fifthly, John G. Ridley, the inventor of the first harvester. Ridley also came from the north of England from Durham, was a Wesleyan who had had associations with Angus. He arrived in 1839 and became a farmer at Hindmarsh. He fell out with the Wesleyans partly over state aid and partly over doctrine. He had begun to question the very great emphasis upon judgment, hell and so on. He was an anti-state aider too. He returned to England in 1853 and for the next 30 years was something of a religious eccentric, publishing tracts on temperance and evangelical religion generally. Methodism and the state aid controversy, 1846 to 1851. Now, the non-Wesleyan groups refused to apply for grants. They saw themselves very much as free churches, or to use the English term, they saw themselves very much as part of the dissenting tradition, the total separation of the state and the church, and the absence of any kind of state aid for religious purposes. James Way, for example, the leader of the Bible Christians, wanted to build a church at Bowden. And Samuel Coombe, who was a brickyard proprietor there suggested that they asked for a government grant. And Way's reply was that he'd rather pack up his bags and go back to England than take such money. Now, official Wesleyanism, both in England and of course here in Australia too, saw itself, not ran itself, saw itself as roughly midway between the Church of England and dissent. It's somewhat difficult to categorise Wesleyanism in England up until about the 1890s. Not till about the 1890s was the Wesleyan Church in England prepared to align itself with the dissenting tradition, that is to say with Congregationalism and the Baptist Church and the Presbyterian Church in England. Wesleyanism, of course, did operate on a voluntary principle in the sense that whosoever will may come. In other words, it drew its members from the whole community. You became a Methodist through free choice. It wasn't a case of being automatically a Methodist because you were born one. Even if you had been born a Wesleyan, you were still supposed to undergo some kind of conversion experience at some time, preferably early in your life. But Wesleyanism in England, which of course very much determined policy here in Australia as well, was not opposed to the state church. Another of the Stevens brothers, Joseph Rayner Stevens, who gets a page or a column in the Dictionary of National Biography, was the first secretary of the Liberation Society, a body opposed to the establishment of the Church of England in Britain, or rather in England. And because of his activities in the Liberation Society, he was expelled from the Wesleyan ministry in 1834. Shortly afterwards, he became very active in the Chartist movement and he spent some time in prison. Now, both as an officer of the Liberation Society and as a Chartist, he as a minister was breaking what remained a pretty fundamental Wesleyan point of view for some decades, and that is the no politics rule. Individual Methodists might take part in politics, and of course many did, but the church was not to be used for political purposes, and ministers were, in political matters, to be completely neutral. And that really didn't change until about the 1880s or the 1890s. Now, the Wesleyan approach to the acceptance of government money for religious purposes was thoroughly pragmatic. If the money was available and it would help the work of God, then let's take it. I suppose the attitude of the Wesleyans was somewhat similar to the Salvation Army. Money was money. If it was available and you could use it for good purposes, then you might as well have it. W.B. Boyce, William Binnington Boyce, the General Superintendent of the Wesleyan Church in Australasia, said, for example, in his advice to the leaders of the church here in South Australia, that the acceptance of state aid would simply mean that we, quote, would be receiving our own money again, that is to say from general revenue. And he said it would be childishly foolish for us to reject it. And he was absolutely emphatic that the Wesleyans in South Australia were not to put themselves in the same camp as the dissenters, such as the Congregationalists under Thomas Quinton Stowe. And also, of course, Wesleyan Methodists have been taking money in New South Wales for some years. Now, the decision of the Wesleyans to take money did cause dissension within the Wesleyan body. Edward Stevens and others left the Wesleyan Church. Stevens helped to organise a body which called itself the Representative Methodist Church, which had some kind of building in Whitmore Square and lasted for 5 or 6 years. He and others were active in the League for the Preservation of Religious Freedom during the late 1840s when this matter was so much debated. The opposition within the Wesleyan Church was partly due to the presence of non-Wesleyans within the membership of that body. The Bible Christians didn't get going out here until 1850. The primitive Methodists were still very weak in the late 1840s, and people who had been Bible Christians in England, and in some cases primitive Methodists in England, became Wesleyans when they came here. because there really wasn't very much difference in the doctrines of the various churches. My wife's great-great-grandfather, George Cole, came out as a stonemason and plasterer. He had been a Bible Christian in England. He became a Wesleyan and was a Wesleyan for 11 years until the debate over state aid. He helped to organise a meeting in 1851 just prior to the election, and he made the mistake, as did his supporters, in advertising this as a Wesleyan meeting. Now that was to bring the Wesleyan church into the political field. He broke the no politics rule, and he and two other lay preachers, or as Methodism called them, local preachers, were expelled from the church. And Cole then joined the Bible Christians, who had got started a year or two before. Early Methodist growth. In the first 30 years, Methodist growth in South Australia was rapid. The Methodists, talking collectively of all the Methodist denominations, quickly outstripped the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians, both churches having much abler ministers. Just a few statistics. In 1860, the Methodists, that is all the Methodist churches, had 171 church buildings and roughly 5,000 adherents. Perhaps I ought to say here that the difference between a member and an adherent was this: that membership was very much a prize. It was not granted lightly back in the last century, and you could be expelled from membership or you could be put on probation. In any case, you didn't become a member until you'd been on probation for 3 months or for 6 months. And within the Methodism, you had the inner circle of members, and then a very much larger group who were normally called adherents or hearers. And I think one normally has to multiply the number of members by 4 to get the total Methodist constituency. Now in 1860, there were 171 churches and 5,000 members. 5 years later, there were 262 churches and just under 7,000 members. And in 1870, there were 328 churches and just over 9,000 members. And so in that 10-year period from 1860 to 1870, the number of churches almost doubled, and likewise the number of members almost doubled. And by 1870, one could say that there was a Methodist cause of some kind in every settlement in South Australia. And that remained pretty much the pattern right up till Union in 1977. There were certain towns, not more than half a dozen, Barmera for example, and Georgetown up in the mid-north, which didn't have a Methodist church, but the church had spread by 1870 to what James Way called the rising settlements, and that spread continued throughout the years from 1870 onwards. Now the main reason why Methodism spread, quite apart from the ideology of Methodism, was its use of laymen. By the ideology of Methodism here I mean the idea of evangelism, the idea that every community should be presented with the opportunity to believe the gospel. And Methodists for generations quoted the words of John Wesley, "The world is my parish." And I suppose 99% of them quoted those words without knowing the context in which they were first uttered. Wesley, as an Oxford Don, didn't regard himself as bound by parish boundaries in Britain, and he went into men's parishes without being invited, and once when he was challenged, he replied to this aggrieved Anglican priest, "I look upon the whole world as my parish." And this phrase, "the world is my parish," became expressive of the general religious ideology of Methodism. Now, apart from this general ideology, as I've said, the main reason why Methodism spread so rapidly was its use of laymen. In most circuits, which was the Methodist term for a group of churches, and originally, of course, it meant just that. A man started one Sunday at one place, and during the week he went from church to church. He made a circuit. Now, in most circuits, and I've worked this out fairly carefully, there was an average of 20 local preachers to every minister. That is to say, in each group of churches you had 20 laymen who could stand up in the pulpit and argue a case before their peers. They looked after money which was not their own, because they were the trustees of the properties. They kept the church accounts, and in this way, quite unconsciously of course, Methodism prepared its laymen for leadership in the wider community, and it's not surprising that so many of these Methodist laymen became chairmen of district councils and so on. Now, any group of laymen could form a Methodist society, they could get a church going, they could organise it, raise the money for a church initially, and they could conduct the services. Now, the reason for this, and those of you with a Catholic or Anglican background may find this hard to appreciate, but the reason for this is that in the theology of Methodism, it was the Bible and preaching from the Bible which created the church. In other words, the sacraments, which necessitated the presence of a priest, were largely optional. And so an ordained man, that is to say, a priest set apart for preaching and for the administration of the sacraments, was never considered absolutely essential. And on the West Coast, for example, towards the end of the last century, there were churches which were ministered to by laymen. Laymen could be given authority to conduct the sacraments. This is because the Methodist view of the sacrament was not, if I can put it this way, a very priestly one at all. And in early Methodism, certainly here in South Australia, as I've said, to some extent the sacraments were largely optional. But what was absolutely essential, of course, was preaching, and preaching from the Bible, and this layman could do. Now, not very many of these laymen had formal qualifications, especially among some of the early settlers. What I think one can assume was that they did have a very good knowledge of the Bible, and also they did have a certain sanctity of life. Whereas the Presbyterians said you had to have a minister, fully trained, etc., Methodism could function without such ministers. A couple of years ago, one Sunday morning, my wife and I went into a vast barn of a church, Carharrick in Cornwall, and there was only a handful of people there, and a Cornish local preacher took the service. Now, the service consisted of the usual hymns and so on, but the main part of the service was his sermon. Now, all in fact that he did was to retell the story of Jonah. But listening to him, I thought, well, now this was the kind of sermon that I imagine a lot of our forefathers listened to. He retold with interesting little touches the story of Jonah. In other words, it was based upon the Bible. And one memorable sentence, if I can pass it on to you, that he used, which I certainly remember from what he said, was when Jonah fled and was in the boat. He summed this up by saying, when you want to run away from God, you can be quite sure that the devil will lay on the transport. Now, that, I imagine, was the kind of sermon which fed the minds, or the souls at least, of many of our Methodist pioneers in the state. The third reason why Methodism spread was what was known as the circuit system. This was an aspect of Methodist connectionalism. The norm was always a group of churches. And in contrast, of course, in Congregationalism, the tradition has been one church separate, although in association with other churches. Now, the advantage of the circuit system was that the strong church helped the weak. To give you a very good example here from this century, and this would have been true back in the last century, the wealthiest church in Methodism at one stage in this state was the Church of Kenttown, Fullerton Road, Kenttown. When I went to Tusmore as a young minister in 1944, Tusmore was part of the Kent Town circuit. Now Tusmore in fact couldn't pay my meagre stipend of £150, $300 a year. What kept Tusmore going, at least what helped to keep a minister at Tusmore, was of course the money given at Kent Town. Now the situations can be reversed, and before the breakup of that circuit, I imagine the situation to some extent had been reversed, and Tusmore was helping weaker churches in the circuit. But in general, what the circuit system meant was that you could have a group of churches, strong and weak, and the strong would help the weak. And furthermore, because of the centralised system of Methodist administration, as a friend of mine in England once said to me, talking to Methodism is like talking to the Kremlin. All you have to do is to go to the top, and what decisions conference makes bind all churches. And so conference had levies which they applied to individual circuits, and so the centralised system of raising money enabled grants to be made to weaker churches and to weaker circuits. And fourthly, the influx of the Cornish. 10% of all applications for passages from 1836 to 1841 came from Cornwall. It was the most Methodist county in England. The second most Methodist county in England was Lincolnshire, where primitive Methodism was fairly strong in the rural villages, in contrast to its strength elsewhere in England. Now, in the 1851 census of church attendance taken in England, 32% of those at church in Cornwall were at a Methodist church, and 13% were at the Church of England. Now, the fact that Cornwall was so Methodist meant that when the Cornish migration got underway to South Australia, and that of course began very early, it meant that the Methodist percentage of the population of South Australia began to grow. Now, not all these Cornish migrants were miners. I imagine that most of you don't need to stress that point. They were labourers, they were artisans, they were farmers, such as my great-great-grandfather, who was a tenant farmer near Gwenyp, which is always associated with mining, and with John Wesley, with Gwenyp Pit. Perhaps half were miners. I'm not sure whether John Tregenza would like to speculate on the figure. Perhaps he may have some more definite information on this. But it did mean that there were concentrations of Methodists where there was mining. At Callington, for example, Willunga with the slate quarries, Kapunda, Burra, and of course the largest concentration of all later in the century at Moonta. Now in this last section, I want to say something about the social composition of Methodism. Say in the mid-1860s, most of the original Methodists coming up were tradesmen and farm labourers. The man who took the first official Methodist service on Kangaroo Island in 1836, who was on the Duke of York with Samuel Stevens, was a man called Samuel East, who was a wheelwright and carpenter. Now, the early exceptions I've already dealt with, men such as Edward Stevens and John G. Ridley and so on, but most of the original Methodists, and this is true of those who formed the first society, with two exceptions, were either tradesmen, artisans, and farm labourers. Now, if we jump ahead about 30 years, the situation as I see it is this, that first of all, by the middle 1860s, there was a top layer of prosperous businessmen, some of whom had started here with very little. And the two great monuments which still exist today and which reflect the prosperity of that Wesleyan group, because it was a Wesleyan group, not a Bible Christian or primitive Methodist group, are the Church of Kent Town and Prince Alfred College, which was established in 1867. For example, at the founding dinner of Prince Alfred College, Thomas Greaves Waterhouse, a merchant, gave £500. And I suppose £500 in 1867 would mean something like, what, $40,000, $50,000 today. George Harris of Harris Scarf gave £250. F.H. Faulding, whose drug company was getting underway, gave £250. John Colton, who had begun as a saddler and ended as a prosperous merchant, gave £300. There were also contributions from John Dunn, who'd come out with very little indeed. And by the 1860s, and certainly by the 1870s and by the 1880s, was a very prosperous flour miller with flour mills in the mid-north and the north, as well as at Mount Barker. And then there were others who gave sums of more than £100, Thomas and William Rose, both of whom were merchants. And so by the mid-1860s there was this top layer of prosperous businessmen. Secondly, there were farmer settlers in the country towns. Most of these began in a small way, and in 2 or 3 generations, of course, the families prospered, and in some cases, of course, the families are still on the land. The Diment family, for example, out from Salisbury. The original Diment was a primitive Methodist settler. Thomas Maslin was a leading Wesleyan farmer down at Aldinga. I'm sure he'd turn his grave. There was a group of farmers at Spring Farm near Clare, Thomas Moyses and Samuel Bray, who established the Methodist church there. And again, on my mother's side, the Trelagan family, which came out, the first member in 1839, became farmers when Mintero was opened up in 1854. Thirdly, there is a handful of pastoralists, not very many. I give you 3 names here. First of all, Edward Spicer. Spicer was a pastoralist who later became a merchant. He became a very substantial benefactor of the Methodist Church. He built a church in 4th Avenue, St. Peter's, which is still there. He also, when he died, established homes for ministers' widows or for retired ministers, and the Spicer Trust is still in operation and those homes are still being used. There was John Carr, who had land down here at Dashwood Gully near Kangarilla, and also over on the west coast and even as far as the Nullarbor Plain. He was a active parliamentarian, also very active Methodist local preacher, even when he was a cabinet minister. And then another name was George Hiles. Now, George Hiles was my wife's great-grandfather. He married George Cole's daughter. He came out from North Petherton in Somerset in 1840 with no money. He came out as a farm labourer. He became a stockman, and gradually he built up his own stock, and then he took out a pastoral lease at a place called Mungibby, just out from Waitara. And George Hiles, by the late 1860s at least, was a very substantial pastoralist up in the Mount Ryan area. There was this handful of pastoralists, but the big ones, of course, were largely Church of England. Fourthly, there were miners. All the Methodist churches were in Kapunda and Borough, the 2 early mining settlements of any size, and the Methodist miners included captains or foremen, as well as the tribute workers, those who worked down in the mine. And then, of course, there were townspeople, a few doctors here and there, many teachers, and many shopkeepers. And in some places it was a leading shop. And labourers. And if I can mention here the name of William Hunt, who came out as a carpenter from Somerset in 1854 and set up a carpenter shop at Mintero. Now, I think in general terms, there were lots of these carpenters, tradesmen and labourers within the Wesleyan church. And William Hunt was a Wesleyan. But the membership generally of the primitive Methodist Church and the Bible Christian Church consists of people who were poorer, or to use the jargon of today, of a lower socio-economic status. Neither of those churches, the primitive Methodists and Bible Christians, had the top layer of profession of prosperous businessmen or any of the really well-to-do farmers and pastoralists. And so by the 1860s, Methodism had spread fairly extensively throughout South Australia, and that spread continued, and it had within it, as I've suggested here, 6 more or less large groups of people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, we have time for a few questions. So if you...
Dr. Arnold, I wonder if you could just briefly tell us why you think Douglas might be a bit hard on Draper. I think from memory of words were that he was a fair specimen of Methodist mediocrity. I think they... How harsh is that?
Well, I think that's very harsh. I think Draper was a very able Methodist superintendent. I wanted to use the word ecclesiastical statesman, but I think that's probably too extreme a phrase. And I don't know on what grounds he would make that kind of statement. Very few of Draper's sermons survive, and I don't think enough survive for him to sort of make that kind of judgment. I think he's mainly in error in dealing with John Eggleston and especially John Wetherspoon. Those two in particular, I think his information is deficient, particularly with regard to Wetherspoon. And it's largely because he didn't have access to the letters, particularly those concerning Wetherspoon. Wetherspoon was the first Methodist minister to have the honour of being charged by his fellow ministers of being unworthy to remain a minister. About 14 I think charges were laid against him. About 10 were sustained. But he's not aware of this plight. He's not aware of the character of the charges against Wetherspoon. Right.
Could I just go back to the argument that I think is very proper of you to put, that the recognition of the doctrine of a free church and a free state was something that grew on the Methodist tradition in South Australia, and to comment that even in your presentation, Dr. Hunt, at times there was, I think, a reflection of something of the mythology. I think you're still struggling with it, the mythology about Methodism, that it was always voluntarist, that it was always dominant in South Australia. And of course, you're in the text of your material, you've shown that neither of those statements were true from the beginning, but both were processes that evolved over time. And I would personally wish to congratulate you on drawing those 2 points out, that they learnt to become voluntarists. It wasn't something that they were automatically such in 1836. Indeed, I like the thought that it's not till the 1890s. And in the same way, that powerful element of them by the 1890s is again something that they had to win. It wasn't again automatic. I think that far too often, looking back, there is this mythology, and I think it contributed to it.
Actually, I think in England, the no politics rule began to be weakened because of the identification of Wesleyan Methodism in the Liberal Party in British politics from about 1875 onwards.
Yes, no earlier.
Yeah, there was a close alignment of the Wesleyan and free churches generally with the Liberal Party of Gladstone. And the main spokesman for a new approach to Methodist involvement in political life in England was Hugh Price Hughes. And, you know, the adage, what is morally right, what is morally wrong can never be politically right. They didn't originate those words with Hugh Price Hughes, but he did use them at a public meeting denouncing Parnell, for example. And maybe it was a minor factor in contributing to the downfall of Parnell.
When I just asked the figures you gave, the congregations associated with the churches, and you said you'd need to multiply by 4. Had you multiplied by 4?
No, I haven't multiplied by 4.
So, yeah.
7, 9.
see, if I can just perhaps conclude, if you, if you're a Methodist and you decide you didn't believe any longer, and you resigned, or at least you resigned, or you were dropped from the membership role, you couldn't get back without sort of going on probation. And you could go to the services, of course, but you couldn't get back as a member. Whereas in the case of, say, an Anglican or a Catholic, you can lose your faith, and then if it comes back, then the next Sunday you can go to communion. You're back. But Methodism had this very clear distinction between those who were members and those who were adherents. And then beyond the adherents were the outsiders. Just before Professor Richards brings this session to a close, I wonder whether I could say a little bit about the Uniting Church Historical Society. We do have a fairly active society. I'm editor of it. And during the luncheon break, if you'd like to see any of our publications, I've brought 4 along with me, as well as our newsletter, which really consists of articles and which goes out every quarter. We organise at least 2, sometimes 3 lectures a year. Most of them are published. David Hilliard is giving one in November in the Westbourne Park Church Hall on popular revivalism in South Australia. And I imagine he'll amplify some of what he's going to say this afternoon. But I've got 4 little books with me. One on Dr. Edward S. Keefe, who I noticed in the paper early in the week, baptised Bob Hawke, dubious claim to fame. That's only 50 cents. He was the leading congregational minister in this state for over 30 years. Methodism in the Adelaide Hills by me, that's $1.50. Early Presbyterianism in South Australia by R.J. Scrimgeour, Mr. Scrimgeour is here, that's $2. And a history of theological education, which 1 or 2 people here might buy, which is now being sold for $3.